Elara did not look back as the heavy wrought iron doors of the king's keep clanged shut, sealing her in stone and shame. The cold dignity she had learned since birth, a necessity for a noblewoman, was now the only armor protecting her soul from the raw, humiliating reality of being a chattel. She had been bought, and for the first time in her life, she was powerless to refuse. The royal beta, a man named Kale, did not drag her to the dank dungeons Elara had prepared for in her mind. Instead, he led her through gilded halls, past tapestries detailing battles of bloody conquest, and into the sun-drenched private wing of the Alpha King. "Remove the dress, Lady Elara," Kale commanded, gesturing to a waiting seamstress, who immediately produced a lavish gown of emerald silk. "The king has no need for another scullery maid. You will be bathed, dressed and prepared. You are now Queen Designate." The title felt like a cruel joke, a heavier chain than iron. A slave, but draped in silk. A pawn, but placed on the central square. Within the hour, Elara stood before King Aldric Voss in his personal solar. The room was not opulent, but ruthlessly efficient. A massive mahogany desk, a map table covering half the floor, and a single stern throne. Aldric was divested of his armor, wearing black leather that only emphasized his formidable physique and the primal power that radiated off him like heat from a forge. He did not look at her as a man looks at a woman, but as a carpenter looks at a tool. "I have no desire for sentiment, Elara of Wynter," Aldric stated, his voice a low, gravelly sound that belonged to a battlefield, not a court. He tapped a finger on a document before him, presumably her bill of sale. "Your father's debt was astronomical. For that price, I require more than just a slave's obedience. I require a queen." He finally met her eyes, which were stormy gray and utterly devoid of warmth. "My kingdom is vast but fractured. I need a politically neutral vessel to bear my heir and unite the peripheral territories. You are of minor noble blood, with no local ties or dangerous alliances. You are perfect for my purpose, disposable if you fail, essential if you succeed." Elara felt the shame like a spike through her heart, yet she held her chin high. She remembered her father's desperate pleading, Aldric's cold, pointing finger, the image from the courtyard, and the sickening weight of the coin changing hands. "I was bought for coin, Your Majesty," she said, her voice steady and controlled, refusing to betray any fear. "You own my body and my future titles, but you do not own my will. I will fulfill the duties of your Queen Designate, but I will not be broken into submission." Aldric's lips curved into a faint, dangerous smile, the first sign of emotion she had seen. "Brave words from a pawn. See, that spirit is precisely why I paid the price, Elara. We shall see if you can hold on to it when the court begins to play their games. Your training begins at dawn." He paused. "Do not fail me. A failed queen is a political liability, and I dispose of liabilities with extreme prejudice." The king had not just demanded her obedience. He had thrown her into a lethal game of chess, expecting her to be both his weapon and his sacrifice. Dawn brought with it Dame Isolde, the mistress of the queen, a woman whose posture was so rigid it seemed carved from ice. Isolde regarded Elara with undisguised contempt, seeing not a future queen, but a hastily purchased insult to the crown. The training began instantly, and it was brutal, less about courtly grace and more about mental endurance. "A queen is not a flower, Lady Elara," Isolde snapped, forcing Elara to stand for hours in a weighted corset while reciting the lineage and alliances of the 5 major houses. "She is a shield. If you crumble under the weight of velvet, you will shatter under the weight of steel." Every lesson was a test of willpower. Elara was taught codes of conduct, the delicate art of poison detection, and the history of every assassination attempt on the Voss throne. The training was designed to break her and to test the very limits of the spirit Aldric had admired. The true test, however, was the wolves of the royal court. During a small evening reception, Elara, dressed in a borrowed gown that felt like a mockery, was introduced to the elite. They circled her like predators, their gazes dissecting her cheap origins and her forced status. The most vicious was Lady Lyra Valerius, a striking brunette with the sharp eyes of a hawk and a lineage that traced back to the previous Alpha King. Lyra had been the presumed favorite, the natural choice to wed Aldric and secure the throne. As Elara attempted to navigate a conversation about trade tariffs, Lyra materialized beside her, offering a saccharine smile. "You carry yourself well, for a commodity. I had expected chains, not silk." "Tell me, Lady Elara," Lyra purred, loud enough for the small assembly to hear, "does the king intend to elevate every daughter bought from a defaulting father, or are you merely a temporary curiosity?" The insult was calculated, shattering Elara's fragile facade and reinforcing her status as property. The air immediately cooled, the assembled nobles waiting for Elara to falter, to show the base nature they expected. Elara took a steadying breath, remembering Aldric's cold words, "Do not fail me." "Curiosity, Lady Lyra, often implies interest, which is more than can be said for obsolescence," Elara replied smoothly, returning the smile with something glacial. "Perhaps the king prefers a queen whose worth is determined by her actions, not merely by the dust on her family's crest." The retort earned a collective gasp and a flash of cold fury in Lyra's eyes. Elara had won the skirmish, but she knew the war was only beginning. The king's chamber was a prison of duty, but the court was a pit of vipers. Aldric might own her, but these people wanted her dead. She realized her struggle was not just against the Alpha King's demands, but against every power structure that sought to dispose of the pawn who dared to sit near the crown. 3 weeks into Elara's grueling regimen, King Aldric decided to observe a lesson. He did not announce his arrival. He simply stood in the doorway of the royal library, his presence a heavy, invisible shield that silenced Dame Isolde mid-sentence. Isolde bowed so low her spine must have protested, then immediately excused herself, leaving Elara alone with the man who owned her. The tension in the vast, book-lined room was suffocating. Elara stared fixedly at the ancient scroll detailing trade routes, refusing to acknowledge the king's scrutiny. Aldric walked past her slowly, his heavy boots echoing on the marble floor. He didn't speak of silks or court gossip. He stopped at the map table where Elara had been tracing the vulnerable northern border. "Tell me, purchased queen designate," Aldric commanded, his voice devoid of any pretense of courtesy. "The northern lords recently defaulted on their timber quotas. Their public reason was disease among the pines. Their true reason?" Elara's mind, honed by hours of Isolde's merciless drilling, did not freeze. This was not a test of memory, but of analysis, a language she understood better than politeness. "Disease is a lie, Your Majesty," Elara said, finally lifting her eyes to meet his intense gold gaze. "The tariffs you imposed on the southern road make transporting the timber to the central markets financially ruinous. They are holding back the supply not out of failure, but to force your hand to renegotiate the road taxes, knowing you need the timber for the spring fortifications." Aldric's posture, which had been rigid, seemed to relax by a fraction. He circled the map table, tracing the northern road with a gloved finger. "A sound observation. Most would assume simple cowardice. You see the leverage." He pushed a silver figurine of a general across the table, positioning it beside a major fortress. "If the northern lords refuse to move the timber, and the Western March decides this is the opportune time to press their territorial claim, how do you defend this fortress with limited supplies until summer?" This was the intellectual duel, the test of her true worth. Elara paused, taking in the fortress's vulnerability. "The fortress cannot be defended conventionally. It's too exposed," she stated. "You sacrifice the fortress, but not the men. Pull the troops back to the Ravine of Sorrows, the narrow pass. That position requires minimal timber for barricades and allows you to use the terrain to nullify the West's numbers. The moment the West attacks the empty fortress, you flank them from the ravine." Aldric stopped breathing. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fireplace. "You speak of human life as expendable units of war," Aldric finally said. A hint of something complex, perhaps approval, perhaps horror, in his tone. "You bought a queen, your majesty, not a priestess," Elara replied, standing tall. "I see not only the spirit I must fight to preserve, but also the duty you fight to uphold." Aldric's eyes narrowed. He had bought a pawn to sit beside him, but she had just proven she had the mind to stand against him. The king's lip twitched, a subtle movement that suggested he was reassessing her value. She was no longer just a political pawn. She was a potential asset, dangerous and compelling, and he saw the strength of the spirit beneath the subservient shell. He had paid for a wife, but he was slowly realizing he might have purchased a rival. He left without another word, leaving Elara both exhausted and strangely exhilarated. She had survived, not by submission, but by being useful. The morning after Elara's impressive tactical analysis, the subtle attacks from the court intensified. They could no longer dismiss her as merely beautiful. They had to ensure she was removed before her intelligence made her irreplaceable. The next move was targeted at her core function, the lineage. The threat arrived during her morning meal. She had learned to inspect every morsel, a grim necessity taught by Isolde. Today, however, the poison was not in the meat, but in the wine. A tasteless, colorless dose of wolfsbane, enough to induce painful fever and, critically, cause temporary infertility. Elara was saved not by observation, but by a tremor of panic from a serving boy, a nervous youth who had accidentally spilled a similar dose on a house cat minutes before, watching it writhe. Elara caught the panic in his scent and saw the subtle tremor in his hand as he poured her goblet. She lifted the goblet to her lips, drawing the attention of the surrounding attendants and, most importantly, Lady Lyra Valerius, who was observing from a nearby window seat, a barely concealed smirk on her face. Elara set the wine down, untouched. "The king pays a high price for my potential to carry his heir. I would be a poor investment indeed if I were to compromise my health on simple table wine." Before Lyra could intervene, Elara gestured to the trembling boy. "The truth, boy. Who paid you to compromise my lineage?" The boy dissolved into tears, pointing a shaking finger toward an obscure minor court official, a cousin of Lyra's, who immediately tried to flee. Aldric's Beta KL, already suspicious of the royal food services, burst into the room with 2 guards. Within the hour, Elara and the king stood in the cold stone dungeon where the captured official was being held. Aldric's face was a mask of cold fury, his alpha scent thick with deadly intent. He confessed. "Lady Lyra's cousin sought to delay the prospect of an heir, hoping I would discard you for being barren," Aldric growled, pulling a heavy executioner's blade from a nearby rack. "A plot against the crown's future is treason. Death is the only suitable payment for this kind of foolishness." As Aldric raised the blade, Elara placed a hand on his armored forearm, stopping him. It was the first time she had initiated physical contact, and the moment was electric and dangerous. "No, your majesty," Elara said, her voice soft but firm. "You purchased me as a pawn, but you value me as a strategist." Treason is punishable by death, but a poor court official, manipulated by a powerful noble like Lyra, is not treason. It is a casualty of power. Aldric turned on her, his golden eyes blazing. "He threatened my line. I do not tolerate weakness or mercy in the face of betrayal." "Then show strength," Elara countered. "Execute him, and you prove to Lyra that terror works. Spare him, exile him, and seize all his family's lands and wealth as an example of the cost of obedience to Lady Lyra. You weaken Lyra's resources and establish a precedent that the king is guided by justice, not just bloody revenge. This will earn respect, not fear, from the wavering lords. Use this moment to be a king, not just an executioner." Aldric stared at the slave he had bought, who was now demanding a political act of mercy and justice. The blade trembled in his grip. He dropped it with a metallic clang. He had been poised to kill, but she had forced him to rule. She had successfully defied his primitive instinct for vengeance and exposed the difference between their priorities. His was control. Hers was authority. The king's choice, to spare the official but ruthlessly seize his family's assets, thereby publicly crippling Elara, was a masterful execution of Elara's strategy. It won her grudging respect in the court, but more importantly, it earned her Aldric's unspoken acknowledgement. The following evening, that acknowledgement became something far more intimate and unexpected. A shadow descended upon the keep. A minor skirmish on the western border had escalated, requiring Aldric's personal intervention. He returned late, well after midnight. His usual alpha aura dimmed by weariness and pain. Elara was in the king's private wing, still awake and studying, when Kael appeared at the door, his face unusually grave. "The king is injured. Not gravely, but the healers are occupied with the soldiers. His Majesty requires assistance with the dressing of the wound and discretion." Elara felt no surge of protective warmth, only the cold, hard tug of duty. If Aldric was compromised, the entire kingdom was vulnerable. His survival was her survival. She followed Kael without question. Aldric was in his solar, stripped to the waist, a ragged gash across his ribs where a foreign blade had slipped past his armor. He looked less like a king and more like a warrior who had fought for too long. His skin was slick with sweat and grime, and his eyes, usually blazing gold, were hooded with exhaustion. He watched Elara approach with a detached stillness, a terrifying surrender of control. "Don't fuss," he commanded, his voice tight. "Just clean it and bind it quickly." Elara knelt, treating the wound with practiced, gentle efficiency. As she worked, she could see the tension lines etched into his face, not from the wound, but from the relentless weight of leadership. He wasn't just tired, he was spent. "The Western March is being led by Lord Terran," Aldric muttered, his head leaning back against the throne. "He is cunning. If I had stayed in the fortress, he would have bypassed it and struck the capital. I had to draw him out. It cost 3 good men." He wasn't speaking to his queen designate. He was speaking to the map on the floor, the abstract representation of the burden that pressed down on him. Elara looked at the gash, then at the heavy, intricate crown resting on his desk, a piece of metal that seemed too heavy for any man's head. "The king's prison is larger than mine," Elara observed quietly, finishing the final knot on the bandage. Aldric's eyes snapped open. "What did you say?" "My prison is the shame of my father's choice and the narrow cell of the queen's chambers," Elara explained, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Yours is the entire kingdom. You have no walls to protect you, only the endless demands of duty and the ever-present threat of betrayal. You cannot abdicate. You cannot retreat. You were born to this burden. Your gold crown is a magnificent chain." The king said nothing. He simply stared at her, seeing not the pawn he had bought, but the fellow captive who understood the nature of his gilded cage. In that moment of shared lonely understanding, the distance between Aldric the owner and Elara the asset narrowed just enough for her to see the man, a man as much a victim of his title as she was a victim of her debt. Elara realized her defiance wasn't just about preserving her own soul, but about lightening the intolerable, crushing weight of the crown he wore. Her duty was shifting from required obedience to calculated strategic support. The Northern Lords, despite the execution of Lyra's scheme, still refused to move their crucial timber, citing an old, forgotten treaty that exempted them from wartime taxes. With the Western March pressing hard, Aldric could not risk leaving the capital, nor could he afford a civil war in the north. His strategic options were depleted, and the pressure was visible on his tightly controlled features. Days after her observation in the solar, Aldric summoned Elara, not to the bedroom but to his war council. The Beta Kael and the head general were present, their expressions grim. "The Northern Lord Rorik is stubborn. He fears force, but he despises weakness," Aldric stated, tossing a sealed scroll onto the table, the treaty Rorik was using as justification. I need a solution that is not bloody and is not a retreat. I need the wood in 3 days. I cannot send KL. It would be seen as a threat. I must remain here to show strength against the West. He looked at Elara, his gold eyes colder and sharper than ever. I will send you, Elara. You are a neutral party, bound by coin and nothing more. If you fail, I disown you. If he harms you, I will burn the north to ash, but your failure will still have crippled the kingdom. This task requires cunning, not an army. Succeed, and you prove your worth to this court and to me. Fail, and you are disposable. Elara didn't hesitate. She knew this was the ultimate test, a dangerous gamble that would define her existence here. I will go, Your Majesty, but I will not appeal to Rorik's loyalty. I will appeal to his greed, and I require a single authorization scroll signed by your hand. Aldric simply signed the blank parchment. He gave her a detachment of 6 guards, led by a silent, watchful captain, and a wagon containing the assets recently seized from Lyra's exiled cousin. Elara arrived at Rorik's grim northern keep and did not present the king's authority. Instead, she laid out the official inventory of Lyra Valerius's former wealth. King Aldric is a man of singular focus, Lord Rorik, Elara told the grizzled, skeptical Alpha. Lyra tried to poison his lineage, so he stripped her ally bare. He has no love for the southern nobles who plot against him, nor does he harbor loyalty for the old moth-eaten treaties they hide behind. She offered the compromise. Aldric would not invalidate the treaty, but he would temporarily waive the southern road tax only for northern timber, replacing the lost revenue by dedicating Lyra's seized wealth to the royal coffers. Rorik got his trade relief, Lyra's faction was further weakened, and Aldric got his timber, all without firing a single arrow. 2 days later, Elara returned, not with the king's guards, but with the first column of northern timber wagons. Aldric met her in his solar alone. He didn't ask for a report. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. You survived, and you delivered. The price I paid was fair. Elara walked to the map table, placing the signed, revised tax agreement beside the king's untouched crown. No, Your Majesty, she said softly, meeting his gaze, the shame of her purchase finally fading beneath the armor of her own proven authority. You paid for a pawn. I delivered a partner. Elara's success in the north solidified her position. The court could no longer treat her as a temporary curiosity. She was now an essential piece of Aldric's governance. The next step was inevitable, the formal betrothal announcement, designed to unite the kingdom against the threats from the west and the machinations of the southern nobles. The announcement ceremony was a suffocating display of power and pretense. Elara stood beside Aldric in the grand hall, wearing a gown of royal silver that felt heavy and suffocating. Aldric placed a massive diamond-set ring on her finger, a ring that felt less like a promise of love and more like a public shackle. They played their roles perfectly, the formidable king and his stoic, newly proven queen-designate. The air was thick with the scent of fear and calculation, especially from Lady Lyra, who stood pale and tight-lipped among the crowd. The silence following the king's declaration was broken by a sudden, frantic commotion at the back of the hall. My daughter! My noble blood will not be soiled by this mockery. Elara Wynter, Elara's father, burst through the ranks of the minor gentry, his face flushed, his clothing threadbare but clinging to the vestiges of old vanity. He had somehow slipped past the outer guards. Fueled by desperation and perhaps a bottle of cheap liquor, he didn't look at Elara. He looked only at the gold on her dress and the diamonds on her hand, seeing them as pieces of his lost wealth. Your Majesty, this is a travesty. The debt is surely paid with her elevation. Her blood is too noble to be treated as chattel. I demand the restoration of my lands and titles. My daughter must be allowed to support her family now that she is part of the crown. Garen was shouting, his voice echoing the avarice that had sold her in the first place. The shame was paralyzing. Elara felt the fragile shield of her authority crumble, replaced by the raw humiliation of her origins. She wasn't standing beside the king. She was back in the bleak courtyard, a piece of property. Her father hadn't just sold her. He was attempting to profit from her degradation a second time. The realization that she meant nothing to him beyond currency cut deeper than any wolfsbane. Aldric's alpha presence intensified instantly, a dangerous low growl rumbling in his chest, silencing the entire hall. He did not move, but the threat radiating from him was palpable. "Elara Wynter," Aldric stated, his voice dangerously level, addressing him by his full, shamed name. "The debt you owe me is paid only by your daughter's continued service. You sold her as chattel, and I own the chattel. Neither her new status nor her person is available to bail out a disgraced fool. You may leave this kingdom and never return. If you ever address my queen-designate again, you will address her from the dungeon." He extended a hand to Elara, his gesture public and possessive. She took it, grateful for the cold, hard press of his fingers. He had protected her from the political disaster and the emotional assault of her father. But his protection came with a harsh reminder. She was still his, purchased and commanded. As Kyle and the guards dragged Garen away, Elara looked at Aldric. He had fought for her status, yet his eyes remained cold, professional, and distant. Their betrothal was a calculated political move, not an emotional connection. The ring on her finger felt heavier than ever, a powerful chain of shared duty, yes, but not a bond of true partnership. She was safe with him, but she was not loved by him. The wedding day arrived, draped in false celebration and genuine tension. The marriage was the final seal on Aldric's power, meant to silence the remaining dissenting houses, particularly the Western March faction still smarting from their earlier defeat. Elara walked down the aisle, her bridal gown of white and gold feeling like funeral shrouds. She met Aldric at the altar, surrounded by the kingdom's elite, every face a mask of political calculation. The moment the high priest raised his hands to place the massive, ancient crown upon Elara's head, the symbolic transfer of power, the air shattered. A shrill alarm cut through the sacred vows. From the ornate choir balcony, a cascade of heavily armored men dropped onto the marble floor, their weapons drawn. It was not a small plot. It was a brazen, orchestrated coup, timed precisely to strike Aldric when he was ceremonially divested of his battle armor. "Terran sends his regards, Alpha King," shouted the leader, a scarred mercenary. As a handful of men immediately surged toward the altar, Aldric, momentarily stunned by the audacity, still roared, his alpha scent filling the room, a primal, deafening call to defense. He shoved Elara violently behind the stone altar just as a crossbow bolt, tipped with a paralyzing poison, struck him squarely in the shoulder. The effect was immediate. The massive, formidable king slumped against the altar, his eyes remaining open and furious, but his body unresponsive. His roar died in his throat, and the scent of fear mixed with betrayal filled the hall. Panic seized the court. Nobles screamed and scattered, trampling one another to reach the doors. The loyal guards, trained only to respond to the Alpha's direct command or Beta Kale's orders, faltered, confused by the king's sudden incapacitation. Elara did not scream. She did not scatter. In the brief, terrifying silence between the chaos and the mercenaries' advance, the rigorous, ruthless training from Isolde and Aldric's endless strategic lectures snapped into place. She was no longer a noblewoman, a slave, or a queen-designate. She was a weapon Aldric had forged, and he had just fallen. Elara grabbed the king's ceremonial short sword, the one used for oath-taking, and vaulted onto the altar steps, standing over Aldric's massive, paralyzed body. "Guards! The king is wounded but conscious! He commands defense of the crown!" she shrieked, her voice cutting through the panic like cold steel. She locked eyes with Beta Kale, who stood frozen, waiting for a command that would never come. "Kale!" she yelled, pointing the blade at the mercenary leader. "3 men to the balcony! Shut down the ingress! You know the king's plan for temple defense! Execute it now!" The command was technically hers, but the strategy was Aldric's. She had used the correct terminology from their war council meetings. Kale, recognizing the strategy, snapped out of his shock. With a responsive roar, he rallied the loyal few, directing them using the exact defensive measures Elara had just recited. As the mercenaries lunged for the paralyzed king, Elara plunged the short sword into the arm of the first man, diverting the attack just long enough for Kael's flank to hit. She did not feel fear, only a devastating, desperate realization. If he died, she lost not only her life and status, but the only person who had ever seen her worth. The detachment, the shield she had maintained for months, fractured. This was not duty. This was survival, fiercely entwined with the man she had come to rely on. She risked everything, throwing her body over the king as the battle erupted around them, sacrificing her last emotional barrier for the captive king. The coup was brutally suppressed. Elara, covered in grime and a few drops of blood, her bridal gown torn, had not moved from Aldric's side. The high priest, recovering from his shock, administered the antidote, and slowly, agonizingly, Aldric's formidable strength began to return. He watched the last of the mercenaries being dragged away, then turned his gaze to Elara. He was still weak, his eyes heavy, but there was a new depth in their golden depths. A raw vulnerability that mirrored the one she had allowed him to see in his solar. He reached out a trembling hand, not to command, but to touch her cheek. "You saved me," he rasped, his voice still rough from the paralysis. "You saved the kingdom. It was your quick wit, your strategy. You were the king today." Elara could only nod, her own emotions a tumultuous storm. The sheer terror she had felt at the thought of losing him, the desperate, unbidden surge of a connection that transcended their cruel agreement. It was all laid bare. The price of leadership, she realized, was not just the crown, but the constant exposure of one's deepest fears and vulnerabilities. Days later, with the Western threat neutralized and Terran captured, the wedding ceremony was rescheduled. This time, there was no pretense of false celebration. The grand hall was filled with an assembly far more subdued, more respectful. Aldric, fully recovered, stood at the altar, no longer in ceremonial robes but in his battle leathers. A subtle acknowledgement of how close they had come to ruin. When Elara, in a new, simpler gown, reached his side, he did not immediately take her hand. He turned to the assembled court, his voice, now strong and resonant, filling the hall. "Today we do not merely marry. We forge a true union," Aldric declared, his eyes sweeping across the wary faces of his nobles. Lady Elara Wynter stood where I could not. She commanded my guards, defended my life, and preserved the future of this kingdom. She is not merely my queen designate. She is a proven leader, a strategic mind, and my equal. He then turned to Elara, his gaze softening, losing its cold, professional edge for the first time. "Elara of Wynter, I offer you my hand, not as your king, but as your partner. Will you accept this crown, not as my purchased possession, but as my chosen queen?" Elara looked at the massive, ancient crown held by the high priest. She thought of her father, of Lyra, of the brutal lessons and the quiet moments with Aldric where she had seen his own gilded cage. This was her moment, not just to accept a title, but to reclaim her soul. "I will, Your Majesty," Elara said, her voice clear and strong, resonating with a newfound authority. "But only if our union is built on more than mere ownership. I will share your crown, I will defend this kingdom, and I will bear your heir. But in return, I demand your respect, your trust, and the acknowledgement that I am your partner in every sense, not your property. My will is my own, and my voice will be heard, even when it challenges yours." Aldric's lips, for the first time, curved into a genuine, unburdened smile. He understood. He had not just bought a queen, he had found one. He reached for her hand, his touch firm and truly possessive, but now with a new tenderness. "Agreed, my queen," he said, pulling her gently toward him. a partnership of respect, strength, and unwavering purpose. As the high priest placed the crown upon Elara's head, it felt not like a chain, but like a glorious weight. She was no longer a pawn. She was a queen, chosen by a king who had finally seen her for who she truly was. Together they faced the future, not as owner and owned, but as two powerful individuals united by duty, forged by fire, and bound by a quiet, burgeoning respect that promised to grow into something more profound. The crowd roared, a genuine sound this time, acknowledging not just their king, but their new queen.